What would you do if the only thing your father left you in his will was a locked iron gate? Not a house, not a field, not a coin or a keepsake, only a gate, rusted at the hinges, set into a high stone wall on the edge of a ruined estate, opening onto ground no one had walked in 20 years. That is what Catherine Fletcher, 23 years old and freshly orphaned, inherited from a father who had died owing more than he had ever owned. But what stood behind that wall, what he had guarded in silence while the rest of his life crumbled around him, would rewrite everything the parish thought it knew about him. Settle in. Stay close. The road into Ashcombe Gate is longer than it looks. She came down from the London coach at the crossroads on a grey October afternoon, her boots already dark with the wet of the last mile. The driver set her small trunk on the verge and touched his hat and was gone before she had finished thanking him. The lane bent away into hedgerow and hawthorn, and beyond the hedgerow lay the low green shoulder of the valley she had not seen since she was a child. She could smell coal smoke somewhere far off, and wet leaves, and the iron tang of rain that had not yet fallen. Catherine stood a long moment in the road. Her dress was black wool, mended at the cuff. Her hands, ungloved, were red from the cold of the coach. In her pocket she carried a single folded letter from the solicitor at Ashcombe, 3 lines long, that had summoned her north for the reading of her father's will. She had not spoken to her father in 7 years. She had learned of his death from a stranger in a shop. The village lay a mile down the lane. She lifted her trunk by its leather strap and began to walk. Ashcombe Gate was not a grand place, and had not been grand in living memory. A dozen slate roofs, a squat grey church, a public house called the Wheatsheaf, a smithy, a row of tenant cottages leaning together like tired mourners. On the ridge above the village stood what remained of her father's estate, a burnt-out shell of a house, its west wing collapsed inward, its chimneys black against the sky. She did not look up at it as she passed. She had promised herself she would not. By the time she reached the solicitor's office above the corn merchants, the rain had begun in earnest. The solicitor was a young man named Mr. Harding, thin and courteous, with ink on his cuff and a black armband new enough to still hold its crease. He offered her tea. She refused it. He offered her a chair. She took it. "Miss Fletcher," he said, "I am sorry." "Thank you," she murmured. He opened a leather folio and drew out a single sheet of paper. His face, she noticed, was pained in a way that did not seem professional. He hesitated before he spoke. "There is very little," he said, "to read. I did not expect there would be." He nodded slowly and turned the paper toward her. She saw her father's hand, unsteady but familiar, at the bottom of the page. Above the signature was one sentence, and one only. "To my daughter, Catherine Fletcher, I leave the walled enclosure at the eastern boundary of the Ashcombe estate, together with the iron gate that closes it, and the sole key thereto, which shall be delivered into her hand upon her arrival." She read it twice, then a third time. "That is all?" she asked. "That is all." "The house. Sold at auction, Miss Fletcher, to settle the debts, as were the fields, the timber, the livestock, and the contents of the rooms. Everything, in fact, save the enclosure, which was by an older deed held separately." "And what is inside it?" Mr. Harding paused. He seemed to weigh his answer with unusual care. "I do not know, Miss Fletcher. No one, so far as I have been able to determine, has been inside those walls in the last 20 years. Your father kept the key on his person until his final hour." He reached into a drawer and drew out a small object wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it on the desk between them and folded back the corners. Inside lay a black iron key, longer than her hand, its bow shaped into a simple looped cross. It was heavier than it looked. She could tell that without lifting it. "He asked, at the end," Mr. Harding said quietly, "that it come to you and to no one else." Catherine reached out and closed her fingers around the key. The metal was cold and rough with age, and something in the feel of it, the weight, the balance, The worn dip where a thumb had rested 1,000 times went through her like a struck note. She said nothing. She only held it. Outside on the stairs, as she left, she heard laughter from the doorway of the wheat sheaf across the square. 2 men in oilskins, then a third, watching her descend with her trunk. "That's Fletcher's girl," one of them said, loud enough to carry. "Come to claim her patch of nettles." "A gate," said another. "He left her a gate." The third man laughed outright. "A gate to nowhere. That's Fletcher for you. Owed the county a fortune and locked up a piece of weeds like it was the crown jewels." She did not turn her head. She walked past them with the key heavy in her pocket and her trunk knocking against her knee, and she felt the flush rise in her cheeks and forced it down again. The rain fell harder. The lane back toward the churchyard shone black in the failing light. What kind of father dies owing everything and leaves his only daughter a locked gate? What could possibly be worth guarding behind a wall no one has opened in 20 years? And why did he ask, at the last, that the key pass to her alone? If a story like this pulls at you, take a moment to leave a comment and subscribe so the next one finds you. And let us know from what corner of the world you are listening tonight. Because Catherine Fletcher had not yet turned the key in the lock, and what still stood behind that wall would humble every laughing voice in Ashcombe Gate before the winter was out. By nightfall the rain had eased to a fine hanging mist, and Catherine took a room at the wheat sheaf because there was nowhere else to take one. The woman at the counter, broad and gray-haired, did not ask her name. She only glanced at the morning dress, at the trunk, at the red hands, and slid a brass number across the wood. "Top of the stairs, left." Catherine murmured her thanks and climbed. The room was small, clean, and cold. A tallow candle, a washstand, a window looking out over the square where the lamplight caught the wet slates in dull silver. She sat on the edge of the bed with the key in her lap and listened to the voices below. They were not quiet voices. They rose through the floorboards in bursts, easy and coarse, the way men talk when they believe the subject of the talk is far away. She heard her father's name 3 times before she stopped counting. She heard the word gate and the word nettles, and once, distinctly, the word fool. She heard a woman laugh, not cruelly, but with the tired amusement of someone who had heard a joke told often. Fletcher's girl, come all the way from London for a keyhole. Catherine set the key on the washstand and did not weep. She had done her weeping on the coach. In the morning, the mist still hung. She went down to the tap room for bread and tea, and the room fell quiet by degrees as she crossed it, the way a pond stills when a shadow passes over. A boy in a leather apron stared. 2 farmers at the far bench bent their heads together. The landlady set the plate down without a word and moved off. Catherine ate slowly. She had learned in 7 years of London lodging houses how to eat under watching eyes. When she stepped out into the square, the antagonist was waiting, though she did not yet know to call him that. He stood by the smithy door in a heavy green coat with brass buttons, tall, ruddy, well-fed, a riding crop tucked under one arm. He was perhaps 50. He watched her come down the step, and he did not trouble to hide his watching. "Miss Fletcher," he said. Catherine stopped. "Mr. Ballard," he said, tipping his hat a bare inch. "I bought your father's house, what was left of it, and the south fields, and the timber." He said it the way a man announces the weather. "I'd have bought the enclosure too. Offered him twice over what the ground was worth. He wouldn't hear it." "I see," Catherine said. "You'll sell it to me now, I expect." "I have not looked at it yet." Ballard laughed, a short, indulgent sound, as though she had said something charming and untrue. "There's nothing to look at, my dear. Weeds and a wall. Your father was a sentimental man about ruined things. It runs in the blood, I'm told." He looked her over then, from the mended cuff to the reddened knuckles, and his mouth softened into pity, which was worse than the laughter. "Come to me when you've seen it. I'll pay you enough to get back to town in something better than a black wool dress." He touched his hat again and walked past her toward the wheat sheaf, whistling low. Catherine stood in the square, with her cheeks burning and her breath held tight in her chest. She did not answer him. She had learned that too. She turned toward the church because it was the only place in the village that had ever felt like anything to her. And as she crossed the lich gate, an old woman was coming out. Small, bent, wrapped in a black shawl, a prayer book pressed to her ribs like a warm loaf. Her eyes were pale and clear and unsurprised. She stopped when she saw Catherine, and something crossed her face that was not quite recognition and not quite pity. "You'll be his girl," the old woman said. Her voice was thin and formal, the way voices grow when they have spent long years in cold rooms. "I am." The old woman studied her for a long moment. Then she reached out one gloved hand and touched Catherine lightly, once, on the wrist above the key-heavy pocket. "Child," she said, "what he kept from the world he kept for you. Do not judge the man by what the ledger says. Judge him by what still stands." Catherine opened her mouth to ask what she meant. The old woman was already moving past her, down the wet path between the yew trees, and did not look back. Her shawl vanished around the corner of the church, and the mist closed after her, and the churchyard held its breath. Catherine stood a long time with her hand on the gate. By noon she had asked directions of the boy at the smithy, who gave them grudgingly, and she set out along the eastern lane with the key in her pocket and nothing else. The lane climbed. It ran between hedgerows heavy with wet hawthorn, past a broken stile, past a field of stubble where 3 crows lifted at her passing. The rain had stopped, but the sky stayed low, a soft flat gray the color of pewter, and the light was the light of an afternoon that had already begun to think about evening. She came up over the shoulder of the hill and saw the estate for the first time in 7 years. The house was worse than she had prepared herself for. The west wing had fallen inward on itself in a heap of blackened timber and cracked slate. The east wing still stood, but its windows were boarded and its chimneys leaned. Weeds had taken the drive. A cart track wound around the ruin and off toward the eastern boundary, and Catherine followed it, past a fallen glass house, past the stump of an old cedar, past the place where the kitchen garden had been, and now was only nettle and dock. The wall rose at the far end of the track, and she saw it fully at last. It was higher than she had expected, 12 feet at least, of soft red brick gone dark with lichen and streaked black by decades of rain. It ran in a long, shallow curve, following the shape of some enclosure hidden inside it, and at the near end stood the gate. A tall arch of black iron worked in a plain, heavy pattern, thick with rust, hung between 2 brick piers capped in weathered stone. Above the arch, set into the brick, a small carved keystone bore a device she could not read from where she stood. She walked up to it slowly. The gate had not been opened, plainly, in a long time. Ivy had climbed one pier and thrown a hood over the top bars. Grass grew thick against the foot. The lock was a great iron plate, cold to the touch, and when she laid her palm on it, she felt the damp and the age go straight up her arm. She took the key from her pocket. She looked at it. She looked at the lock. She did not turn it. Instead, she stepped back and sat down on her small trunk in the wet grass and looked up at the wall as the light went out of the sky. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the walk. She wanted, she realized, to know the shape of the thing before she opened it. She wanted to sit with it, the way one sits with a coffin before the lid comes off, out of respect for what one does not yet understand. The rooks came home to the ruin behind her, calling. A single owl answered from the far woods. The mist thickened. Somewhere in the village below, a bell rang the hour, and the sound came up thin across the fields. Catherine drew her shawl tighter, and she stayed. She stayed until the wall was a black line against a black sky, and then she rose stiffly and walked back down the lane to the wheat sheaf, with the key still cold in her pocket and the lock still unturned, and she slept that night with the iron laid on the pillow beside her cheek, and she listened, half in dreaming, for whatever it was that still stood behind that wall to make its first small sound. She woke before the light. The mist had not lifted. The window above the square was a square of gray. The key was where she had left it, cold as a stone lifted from a stream, and when she took it into her hand it seemed to have grown heavier in the night, as if it had drunk something from her sleep. She dressed by the tallow stub, ate nothing, and went out into the lane while the village was still shuttered. Only the smithy chimney showed a thin ribbon of smoke against the pewter sky. She climbed the eastern lane again. the hedgerows dripped. A hare crossed the track and stopped and watched her and went on. When she came over the hill, the ruin looked smaller in the flat morning light, and the wall looked larger. She walked past the fallen glass house and the cedar stump and the nettles, and she came to the gate, and this time she looked at it properly, as one looks at a face one means to know. She looked first at the keystone above the arch. She had not been able to read it the day before. Now she stood on tiptoe with her hand against the cold pier, and the device slowly gave up its shape to her. It was a looped cross, worn shallow by weather, the same simple loop that formed the bow of the key in her pocket. She lowered her heel to the grass and stood very still. The maker of the gate and the maker of the key had been the same hand, or had at least been told to answer to one another. That was not the work of a man who had forgotten a piece of ground. She walked slowly the length of the wall. It curved away from the gate in a long, shallow arc, and she followed it, brushing the brick with her fingertips as she went. The mortar was old but not crumbling. Someone at some point had repointed it. The newer joints were paler than the old, and they ran in patches, not in lines, as though a hand had gone along the wall every so often, mending only what needed mending. She counted 3 such patches before she stopped counting. The wall had been tended. Not lately, perhaps, but within a life. Within her father's life. At the far corner she found the second thing that did not fit. Set low in the brick, no higher than her knee, a single course had been laid differently from the rest. The bricks there were smaller and darker, and among them one brick had been turned so that its short face showed instead of its long, and into that short face a letter had been cut. Not deep, not showy, a single letter, weathered but plain enough when she crouched to see it, a letter C. She knelt in the wet grass with her hand against the brick, and did not move for a long moment. C was her own initial. C was also, she remembered slowly, the initial of her mother, who had died when Catherine was 9, and whose Christian name had been Charlotte. She could not yet say which C the brick was meant to be. She only knew that a man who had left her nothing but a gate had also, somewhere in the years of his ruin, walked out to this quiet corner and cut a letter into a wall no one was meant to see. She rose. She did not go back to the gate. She did not take out the key. She walked the rest of the wall's length, marking in her mind each place where the mortar had been mended and the one place where the letter stood, and when she came round again to the front she only laid her hand on the iron plate of the lock, as one lays a hand on a horse's neck to quiet it, and she went back down the lane to the village with her thoughts running under her silence like water under ice. That afternoon she asked the landlady for the loan of a broom, a bucket, and a scrubbing brush, and offered a shilling from the small purse at her waist. The landlady looked at her a long moment, then at the shilling, and pushed the coin back across the wood. "Take them," she said. "Bring them back clean." Catherine thanked her. From the smithy she asked, with the boy's grudging help, for the loan of a billhook and a spade, and she promised their return by the week's end. The smith himself, a heavy, quiet man with a burnt forearm, looked at her over the anvil and nodded once without speaking, and the boy laid the tools in a sack for her without meeting her eyes. She carried them up the lane in 2 trips. On the second trip, as she came round the last bend below the ruin, a thin brown dog rose from the ditch and fell in behind her. It was old, its muzzle was gray, and its ribs showed under a coat the color of wet bracken. It did not bark, did not come close, did not fall away. It walked 6 paces behind her all the way to the gate, sat down in the grass when she set down the sack, and watched her with the patient eyes of a creature that had already decided. She began at the foot of the wall on the outside, because the outside was hers to work whether she opened the gate or not. She cleared the nettles first, cutting them low with the billhook, gathering them in armfuls with the sack wrapped around her hands. She worked the grass back from the base of the piers with the spade. She scraped the moss from the stone caps. She brought water in the bucket from the trough at the ruined stable yard and scrubbed the iron plate of the lock until the rust came off in flakes onto the grass and the metal beneath showed dark and sound. The dog watched. When she stopped to breathe, it laid its chin on its paws. The work told her things her looking had not. Under the nettles, she found the remains of a flagged path, 3 stones wide, that led from the lane straight to the gate. Someone had once walked out here regularly enough to want a dry way. Under the moss on the western pier, she found an iron ring set into the brick at shoulder height, and from it hung the corroded remains of a small brass bell, no bigger than a pear. There had been a bell at this gate. Someone had rung, and someone had answered. By the second day, her hands were raw, and her back would not straighten easily when she rose. She worked from first light until her arms would not lift the billhook, and then she sat on her trunk with the dog against her knee and ate the bread and cheese the landlady had wrapped in a cloth without asking. On the third day, working along the base of the eastern pier, she found a second letter cut low in the brick, matching the first. Not a C this time. An F, her father's initial. Fletcher, cut by the same hand, at the same depth, in the same modest, secret place. She sat back on her heels in the grass. The dog pressed its warm side against her leg. Somewhere behind the wall, a blackbird she had not yet seen sang 3 clear notes and then stopped, and the silence after was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a room in which someone has just set down a cup. Catherine stayed on her heels a long moment. Then she rose, brushed the wet from her skirt, and went to the gate. The dog followed, and sat where it had been sitting since morning. She took the key from her pocket. The iron plate she had scrubbed the day before was clean enough now to show the keyhole plainly. She fitted the key. It went in past the first ward with a small dry protest, past the second, and stopped. She drew it out, wiped it on her sleeve, spat on the bit, and fitted it again. This time it seated to the shoulder. She set both hands on the bow and turned. The lock did not turn. She waited, breathed, and turned again with her whole weight behind it. Something inside the iron gave, not broke, but yielded, and the bolt slid back with a long, grating sigh that she felt through her wrists. She stood a moment with her forehead against the cold plate. Then she pushed the gate. It moved. Rust flaked from the hinges in red powder. Ivy tore quietly along the top bar, and the gate opened inward the width of her shoulders and stopped, caught by grass. She stepped through. At first she could not make sense of what she was seeing. She had expected weeds and brambles to the height of a man, a ruined ornament, a heap of what had been. Instead, there was a path, flagged, 3 stones wide, the same modest path as outside the wall, but here, kept. On either side of the path, low box hedges, clipped within the last year, ran in 2 straight lines toward the far end of the enclosure. Between the hedges, order. Beds turned in autumn, mulched with straw. A pear tree espaliered against the south wall, its branches tied with new twine. Rose canes cut back and heeled in. A stone bench beneath a plum. Beyond, at the far end, a small building she had not been able to see from any road, low and white-limed with a slate roof sound to its ridge, a stone chimney, 2 shuttered windows, and a green door. She did not move for a long time. The dog crossed the threshold behind her and stood at her heel. She walked the path slowly. Everything she passed had been cared for by hands not long absent. The straw on the beds was this year's straw. The twine on the pear was last spring's twine, still white in places. The gravel edging the beds was raked. Under the plum she found a pair of shears wrapped in oilcloth and laid on the bench as if the person using them had only stepped away to fetch string. At the door of the small building she stopped and set her hand on the wood. She thought, absurdly, of knocking. She lifted the latch. It opened. Inside was a single room. A stone floor swept clean. A narrow bed made up with a gray blanket, a table under the window with a lamp, a tin of tea, a plate, and a cup upended on a folded cloth, a hearth with laid kindling ready for the match, a shelf of books, none of them fine, most of them practical, a herbal, a book of grafting, an old parish Bible, a small ledger. On the wall above the table, one framed thing, a pencil portrait of a woman with her hair up and her mouth grave. Charlotte, Catherine's mother, drawn from life, at perhaps 30. Catherine sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs would not hold her. The dog lay across her feet. On the table, beside the lamp, was a letter, folded, addressed in her father's hand to Catherine Fletcher. She did not open it at once. She looked at the room and understood, in pieces, what she was seeing. Her father had not lost this. He had sold the house, the fields, the timber, the beasts, the beds and the plate, the very knives from the kitchen, to keep this. He had rung a bell at a gate and been let in. He had tied twine and cut roses and slept sometimes on this narrow bed, under the pencil portrait of his wife. He had done it alone, and he had done it in secret, and he had done it while the village called him a fool, and the ledger called him a debtor. She opened the letter. It was short. Her father wrote that he had not been a good man in most of the ways men are measured, that he had lost what he had been given by his own folly, that he had not written to her in 7 years because he had not known how to speak to her without asking her for something, and that he had kept this garden and this room because they had been her mother's before they were his, and because he had believed, without evidence, that Catherine would one day walk in at the gate. He wrote that the woman who tended the place with him, Mrs. Ainsley from the far cottage, whom Catherine would know by her prayer book, had promised to keep it as it was until Catherine came. He wrote that the ground had been held by a separate deed since her mother's marriage, and could not be taken for his debts, and that this was the one thing in his life he had been careful about. He signed himself only, your father. Catherine folded the letter and pressed it flat against her knee. She did not weep. She sat in the quiet room with the dog on her feet, and outside the blackbirds sang again, and the sound came in through the open door. She stayed until dusk. Then she rose, closed the shutters, banked the kindling for another day, and walked out through the gate and drew it to behind her. She did not lock it. She could not now bring herself to. That night the wind rose. By the time Catherine reached the wheat sheaf, the mist had turned to a driving rain out of the east, and the sign over the door was banging on its hook. She ate what the landlady set before her without tasting it, and went up to her room with her clothes wet through. She meant to sleep. She could not. She lay with the key on the washstand and the folded letter under her pillow and listened to the wind take the slates of the village one by one. Toward midnight there was a hammering at the tap-room door. She heard the landlady's voice, low and sharp, and a man's voice answering, and then boots on the stair and a knock at her own door. It was the smith's boy, wet to the skin, cap in hand. He said, quiet as he could, "Mrs. says, fire, up the ridge." Catherine was on her feet before he had finished. "Where?" she said. "The east wing," he said. "Ballard's men, burning what's left for the lead." She did not stop for a shawl. She went down the stairs in her boots and her wet dress and out into the rain with the boy behind her. Halfway up the lane she could see the glow through the trees, orange and low, and could smell what she had not smelled in 7 years. Old timber burning wet, and lead going soft in the heat. At the ruin, 4 men in oilskins were working with hooks at the collapsed roof of the east wing, tearing at the leadwork, while a fire they had set in the joists burned upward through the rain. Ballard stood back among the yews in his green coat, watching. He turned when he saw her and did not look surprised. "Miss Fletcher," he said, "you should go down." "You are on my father's ground," Catherine said. "Your father's ground was sold," Ballard said. "This is mine." The wind shifted then, and a gout of burning straw lifted off the roof and blew east, over the kitchen garden, over the cedar stump, toward the wall. Catherine saw it go. She saw where it would land. She turned and ran. She ran along the cart track with the rain in her face and the light of the fire behind her throwing her shadow long. The dog came out of the grass and ran with her. At the gate, she pushed through and ran up the flagged path, and there, on the straw of the nearest bed, a burning knot was already smoking, and another had caught in the dry canes healed beside the pair. Catherine did not think. She dragged the straw off the bed with her bare hands and stamped it into the wet earth. She beat the canes with her shawl until the shawl caught, and she flung it down and beat that with the flat of the spade she had left leaning by the bench. She went along the wall, pulling burning debris from the beds as it came over, one, another, and setting her boots on each until it was black. At some point, Mrs. Ainsley was there, small and bent in her black shawl, with a bucket from the trough. At some point the smith was there in his leather apron, throwing wet sacking on the pear tree. At some point the boy was there with another bucket, and the landlady behind him with a third. They had come up the lane without being asked. Catherine did not stop to see them arrive. She saw only the next spark, and the next, and the shears wrapped in oilcloth on the bench which she moved once out of the path of a falling ember without knowing she had done it. When the wind at last dropped and the rain began in earnest and the fire on the ridge sank into itself hissing, Catherine was on her knees in the middle of the garden with her palms burned and her hair wet against her face, and the small white building at the far end stood untouched, its slates dark with rain, its green door shut, its shutters sound. She looked at it a long time. Then she got up. By dawn the rain had softened to a gray drift, and the ridge above the village smoked in thin ribbons that would not lift. The east wing was gone. What Ballard's men had wanted for the lead lay in a wet black heap among the yews, and the yews themselves were scorched to brown on the side that faced the ruin. Ballard was not there. His men were not there. Only their hooks lay in the grass where they had dropped them when the wind turned. Catherine came up the lane at first light with her burned palms wrapped in strips torn from the landlady's clean linen. Mrs. Ainsley walked beside her with the prayer book pressed to her ribs. The smith walked behind with the boy. They did not speak. At the gate the dog was waiting where it had lain through the last hour of the night, and it rose stiffly and pressed its head against Catherine's knee as she passed. Word traveled, as word does in a village of a dozen slate roofs. By mid-morning the two farmers from the tap-room had come up with a cart and a load of fresh straw and stood at the gate with their caps in their hands, waiting to be told where to set it down. By noon, a woman Catherine did not know had brought a jar of salve for her palms, and another had brought bread, and a third had brought a folded blanket that smelled of lavender. They set these things inside the gate and did not step further in. They looked at the box hedges and the espaliered pear and the small white building at the far end, and they were quiet in the way people are quiet in a church they have walked past for years without entering. Mr. Harding came up in the afternoon in a black coat wet at the shoulders. He stood inside the gate a long time before he spoke. He said softly, "So this is what he kept." Catherine said, "It is." Mr. Harding took from his folio the older deed of which he had spoken in his office, and he read to her from it, and Catherine learned that the ground had been settled on her mother Charlotte at her marriage, and could not, by any law of debt, be touched. He said, "Your father was careful about one thing." Catherine said, "I know." Ballard came on the third day. He came alone, on foot, without the riding crop, and without the green coat, wearing a plain brown coat and carrying his hat in his hand. He stopped at the gate and did not come through. He said, "Miss Fletcher, my men acted beyond what I asked. The fire was not meant to travel." Catherine looked at him across the flagged path and said, "It traveled." Ballard was quiet. Then he said, "I will pay for the yews and for the straw." Catherine said, "Pay the smith for his sacking. Pay Mrs. Ainsley for her bucket. The yews will come back." Ballard put his hat on and touched the brim and walked back down the lane, and he did not whistle. That evening, the old parish vicar, whom Catherine had not yet met, came up with a lantern and sat on the stone bench under the plum with her for a quarter of an hour, saying almost nothing, and then went down again. The chorus of the village had turned, not with noise, but with the small movement by which a room grows warm. Days passed. The burned beds were cleared and turned. Fresh straw was laid. The pear tree, scorched along one branch, was pruned back by the smith, who knew grafting, and Mrs. Ainsley tied the new twine. Catherine slept in the small white building now, on the narrow bed under her mother's portrait, with the dog across her feet, and the shears wrapped in oilcloth back on the bench where she had first found them. Her palms healed slowly and left pale marks she would carry. A letter came from London from a lodging-house she had left, forwarded twice, asking after the trunk she had taken away. Catherine wrote back that the trunk had arrived where it was going. she did not write more. She had nothing more to say to London. On an afternoon in the second week of November, when the last of the leaves had come off the plum and the light came low and clean across the wall, Mr. Harding walked up the lane again with a folded paper. He gave it to Catherine on the bench. It was the old deed made plain in his own careful hand, with her name written at the foot in the place her father's had been, and a small note in the margin recording that the enclosure and the building within it stood in her sole possession, free of any claim. He said, "You had it already. This only says so." Catherine folded the paper and put it in her pocket beside the black iron key. The vicar came again on the following Sunday and asked, without asking, whether she might open the gate on St. Thomas's Day, so that any in the village who wished might walk the path once and see the pear tree and the plum. Catherine said she would. On that day, in a slow, thin sun, some 30 souls came up the lane and walked the flagged path 3 stones wide and stood a moment at the bench and went out again, and none of them spoke above the sound of their own boots on the stone. Mrs. Ainsley stood at the gate and named the roses for those who asked. The dog lay at the threshold and let itself be touched by every hand that reached down. That evening, when the last of them had gone and the gate was drawn shut but not locked, Catherine sat on the stone bench under the bare plum with the dog against her knee. The sky above the wall had turned to a low honey color, and the brick of the wall had warmed to the shade of a banked coal. Somewhere beyond the ruin a blackbird sang 3 notes and stopped, as it had sung on the day she found the letter F cut low in the pier. Mrs. Ainsley came out of the small white building, carrying the lamp unlit, and set it on the bench beside her, and stood a moment with her hand on Catherine's shoulder, and went down the lane home. Catherine looked along the flagged path, past the box hedges, past the espaliered pear with its new twine, past the beds turned and mulched for the winter, to the green door of the small white building, and she said quietly, to the dog and to no one, "He did not leave me a gate. He left me a way in." The dog thumped its tail once against the stone. The light held a long while, the way it does at that hour in that county in that month, and then it went, and Catherine rose and closed the shutters and banked the fire and drew the gate shut behind her, and walked down the lane toward the lit windows of the wheat sheaf, where a place had been kept for her at the long table without her having asked. Thank you for staying with Catherine to the end of her long walk home, a story about what is kept when everything else is lost. If it moved you, leave a kind word below, share where you are listening from, and follow along for the next tale of a widow, a shuttered mill, and a name found written on the underside of a floorboard. Rest easy tonight.